everyone. So in this PowerPoint, we're going to go over both Russia in the 19th century, and then you'll stop, and then tomorrow do Japan in the 19th century. So we're continuing just like we were in chapter 26 with learning about how different parts of the world responded to industrialization and imperialism. So today we're going to learn about Russia and the challenges it faced in this changing world of the 19th century. So first, a review question: who was the first czar to open Russia to westernization? And if you'd like to, you can pause the video and answer that question. The correct answer is Peter the Great. So remember, Peter the Great traveled to Western Europe and learned about military technology and all of the new things going on in Europe, and brought that back to Russia and tried to really model Russia after that. So he did things like change the government, he incorporated military technology, and he tried to change the customs, like the style of dress and things like that of the upper classes. A key thing to understand about Russia is that Russia was very conservative in the 19th century. So we learned about how there were different revolutions guided by nationalism and liberalism in the rest of Europe at the time, but Russia really tried to maintain its same government through this whole period. So Tsar Alexander I is the one that held off Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and he also supported conservative forces at the Congress of Vienna. Through the Congress of Vienna, which remember was the meeting where the countries met to decide how to divide up Napoleon's territory after he was defeated, through that Russia gained territory in Eastern Europe, including Poland. So they're conservative because they don't really want to change their government. They want to maintain the same kind of monarchy that they've had. They don't really want to grant rights to the people or anything like that. So despite the fact that Russia's leaders wanted to maintain a conservative government, liberal ideas still filtered into Russia, because in Western Europe, people are very inspired by the Enlightenment. We've had the French Revolution, revolutions, and revolts where people are trying to gain more rights have occurred in Western Europe. And so even though Russia is more conservative and more closed off, people still hear about those things going on in the rest of Europe. And so this led partially to a revolt in 1825 called the Decembrist Revolt. The Decembrist Revolt was led by Western-oriented army officers who sought political reform. So what basically happened is that one of the czars died, and they wanted the new czar to accept reforms and try to make some political changes, like including giving people representation, and that didn't happen. And so they refused to swear allegiance to the new leader. And so Tsar Nicholas I, who is now in power, responded to this with repression. So he crushed the rebellion, he restricted freedom of the press, he carefully watched education to make sure that people were only being instructed in like the traditional forms of Russian government. He had political opponents arrested and expanded the use of secret police. So this is important because it's one of the first times where Russian people revolt and demand more freedom in their government, and the government just totally doesn't listen and just crushes the rebellion. So it's important just to remember what's going on in the rest of the world at this time. In 1830 and 1848 in Western Europe, like you see on the map, there's a ton of different revolutions and revolts throughout Europe. And these are people who either want nationalism and a homeland for their people, or they're liberals who want representation and voting and constitutions and the end of monarchies. And a lot of these revolts were unsuccessful, but the key thing for Russia is that Russia was involved and helped other countries stop their revolts. So for example, we learned about the Hungarians revolting in the Austrian Empire and how Russia sent its military to help Austria just totally crush that revolt. Another question here is, how did Russia feel about the Ottoman Empire? So Russia sees the Ottoman Empire south of Russia and sees that the Ottomans are in decline, which you've learned about by this point. And so they really have their eye on that, and they're hoping that when the Ottomans fall, maybe Russia can take over some of that territory. Another way that Russia was very conservative is that they maintained the system of feudalism long after Western Europe. So feudalism is long gone in Western Europe by this point. People are not living as serfs anymore, where they have all these legal restrictions on them. But in Russia, that system still continues. And the farming methods in Russia were very antiquated. And so as they needed more food for a growing population, rather than introducing new technology, they just increased their obligations on the serfs. So the serfs had to pay more and more of their crops over to the landlords rather than finding new and more productive methods. And so the lives of serfs in Russia were especially hard because they had such heavy burdens on them in terms of what they had to pay to their landlords. Russia was also very slow to industrialize. So they began slowly industrializing, opening a few factories in Western Russia modeled after those in Western Europe. But they didn't really have their own technology and their own middle class. So if you think back to the Industrial Revolution, the people who were entrepreneurs in places like Great Britain and started their own businesses, these were people who had saved up a little bit of money and they could invest in a new business and open a factory or something like that. Russia really didn't have that, and that's really because, I would say, because of serfdom. Because if you think about it, in Russia, you're pretty much either a landlord, like you already have land and you're doing really well, so you don't really have much of an incentive to open a new business, or you're a serf. And if you're a serf, there's no way you're going to be able to save money and start your own business. So Russia didn't have a middle class. So the middle class in countries like Great Britain are the people who started the factories and really took off with industrialization. In Russia, because they are still living under a feudal system, their social structure just doesn't really lend itself to that. And so because of that, they had to import a lot of their machinery from Western Europe, and the factories that were started were generally owned by the government rather than by entrepreneurs or private citizens like we saw in Western Europe. And this is a process that happened very slowly. Russia remained largely agricultural during this time period. One of the events that kind of started to change the course of Russia was the Crimean War. And for WAP, you really don't need to know much about the Crimean War, but we'll go over it real briefly so you understand how it started to change the mindset in Russia. So Russia was starting to expand southwestward, and as they saw the Ottoman Empire weakening, they saw that as an opportunity to hopefully gain some territory and further expand their empire. And so Russia went to war against the Ottomans to try to gain control of their territory. Now, even though previously Russia had worked with other countries like Austria, even Britain and France, to maintain the balance of power in Europe, which is the idea that no one country should be too powerful, as countries like Britain and France see that Russia might defeat the Ottoman Empire and gain all this territory and become a very powerful empire, that worries them because that's going to upset the balance of power, and Russia will be like the new dominant force in Europe. Now, the reason they thought this was possible is because Russia has this huge empire already in terms of land, and they view Russia as a very powerful nation, not realizing that Russia really wasn't up to date on their technology. And so Britain and France entered this war against Russia to try to stop Russia from being able to take over the Ottoman Empire. And they were successful. And so Russia was driven back from Crimea, which is this little peninsula down here on the Black Sea, in defeat. Okay, so Britain and France won the war against Russia. And the reason this is significant is because it demonstrated to the world that Russia was not as powerful as people thought, that they were behind in their technology, and that they were able to, even like on their own home turf over here in Eastern Europe, were able to be pretty easily defeated by Britain and France. So following the defeat of Russia in the Crimean War, some people in Russia realized they needed to make some changes. And Tsar Alexander II reacted to the defeat of Russia in the Crimean War by focusing on the economy and the need to industrialize. And like we've seen in other places, he really tried to modernize and industrialize while still maintaining his own power and the traditional elites. So he's not wanting to just like drastically change the whole system. He still wants to be the monarch in charge. He still wants the nobles to be in power. But one of the things he realized would help change and modernize Russia is to end the feudal system. And so in 1861, the serfs in Russia were emancipated. The serfs received small plots of land, but they had to pay for these, and that took a very long time. So the serfs now, they're not legally tied to the land anymore. They're not almost like owned by the landlords, but they have very heavy debts. And so it's not as if the serfs are freed and everything's great for them. They have to pay for this land, and that takes often generations. And so this continued to lead to tensions between social classes. It says here this led to continued resentment of landlords who held their debts. Another problem is that the serfs now are independent, but they still have no voice in the government. They didn't gain any kind of political rights or representation, and that's going to cause further resentment later on. Alexander II also instituted zemstvos, or local political councils. So he allowed people to have representation on the local level. So now individual villages could form their own councils and make decisions that affected them just on the local level. He also tried to increase education because he recognized that with industrialization, people were going to need to be more educated for the new jobs that were going to come up. And so this led to an increase in literacy within Russia. However, he tried really hard to not introduce any reforms that would potentially reduce his own power. Now, education is a tricky thing when you're wanting to maintain things the way they have always been, because as people become educated and can read and write and have access to new ideas through reading, that can cause some issues if you're trying to maintain things the way they've always been, and we'll see how that plays out. Another person who was very influential in the industrialization of Russia was Count Sergei Witte, who was Russia's finance minister. So some of the things that he put into place: he introduced tariffs to protect fledgling Russian industry. So he put tariffs on foreign goods. And the idea of a tariff, I think you guys already know, is that if you put a tariff on foreign products, the foreign products are more expensive to consumers, and so it encourages people to buy products that are made in your own country. So he wants people to buy products that are being made in the Russian factories versus ones that are being made in Western Europe. He also improved banking and encouraged foreign investment in Russia. So he encouraged, because he saw that Russia was struggling, like they didn't have much of a middle class, a lot of entrepreneurs, he encouraged people to come from other countries and build factories in Russia and get that going. The problem with that is that the profits from those new industries are really not staying in Russia. They're going to the foreign investors. And so by 1900, half of the factories in Russia were owned by foreigners, and huge debts were owed to foreigners despite increases in industry in areas like steel, oil, and textiles. So he's really trying to get the Russian economy and industrialization going, but there's also some downsides to his particular policies and ways of doing this. So like I said before, because of the lack of middle class, many industries had to be backed by the government. And so this is very different than the way industrialization played out in somewhere like Great Britain, where the industries were privately owned. One of the major achievements, though, of Russia during the 19th century is the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Because we know Russia has this huge territory, and you hopefully remember from world geography that Russia also has a lot of natural resources and a lot of minerals and metals and things like that. But a lot of those are located off in the east where most people don't live, because most people in Russia live on the western side. And so the railroad allowed them to access iron and coal and made the export of all of those different products easier to the west. And so by the 1880s, modern factories were being built in western Russian cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. And just like we saw in industrialization in the West, as factories are built, peasants start to migrate towards the cities looking for new opportunities for work. And think about all the problems that occurred in urban areas as a result of industrialization in Western Europe, like the poverty and the poor living conditions and all of that. That now happens in Russia too. So they develop a new class of people, the urban working class, which suffers in the same way as the early industrial workers in other places did. So here's just a map of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So you can see it goes all the way from St. Petersburg in Western Russia all the way to the Pacific. And then this is just a map of Russian natural resources and minerals. So the point is just to show you, like in the eastern side where there's not a lot of population, there are a lot of natural resources. And so the Trans-Siberian Railroad was important for them to be able to extract those resources and then ship them to where they could be used. So one of the problems with the reforms of Alexander II is that it encouraged people to hope for and demand more changes, because people saw that he was opening up the government a little bit and that he freed the serfs and things like that. And so they hoped that he would continue and possibly grant representation and a more open government. But Alexander had no intention of doing that. And so a major problem here is that people in Russia still don't have voting like in Western Europe. And so they have no official way to voice their complaints. So in Great Britain, for example, a Western European country, by the end of the 19th century, most men in Britain could vote. And so they have a legal way, if they're upset about what the government is doing, they can vote for a new candidate and get somebody else in power. In Russia, they still don't have any of that. So as they're having all these changes of industrialization and all these class changes, people have no way to have their voice heard. And so there's a number of groups that start to challenge the authority of the government. One would be nationalists. So people, ethnic minorities within Russia in areas like Ukraine, different ethnic minorities want to break off from Russia and form their own nation for their own people. So nationalists are one group. Number two would be radical intelligentsia. The intelligentsia in Russia are people who have been Western educated. So these would be people who possibly traveled to the West and studied there. And so they're much more familiar with ideas like those of the Enlightenment and social contract and natural rights. And so these are people who start to spread those ideas throughout Russia and encourage people to demand change. And then three would be the anarchists. So because Russia was so oppressive, and like think about the Decembrist revolt, like it was just totally crushed. They have no representation. Some people in Russia thought it would be a good idea to just do away with the government overall. Like this isn't working. We need a drastically different type of society. And so anarchists tended to use terroristic methods and violence to try to evoke change and get things to happen. So because the Russian government refused to change itself very much and grant representation, you have these different groups of people who start challenging the government even more. Another group that started to gain a following are Marxists. So some intelligentsias adopted Marxist philosophies, and the leader of one of the Marxist groups in Russia was Lenin, and we know him just as Vladimir Lenin or V.I. Lenin. He was one of the most active Marxist leaders. He had a twist on communism, because remember when we studied Karl Marx said that it's the workers, the industrial workers, who are the proletariat, who are the oppressed class, and that they are going to get so fed up with the system that they're going to stage a violent revolution and overthrow the bourgeoisie, which in Marxism are the factory owners or the oppressors. Now, the problem with Marxist theory is that it doesn't quite fit what's going on in Russia. In somewhere like Western Europe, where there's lots of industrial workers who are living in poverty, like that kind of makes sense. But remember, Russia is just beginning to industrialize. So most of their people are still poor peasants. They have some industrial workers, but it's not the huge segment of society. Also, they don't have this class of middle-class factory owners, because who owns most of the factories? The government does. Okay, so Karl Marx's theory doesn't really fully fit with what's going on in Russia. And so Lenin modified the theory. So that's why sometimes we call it like Leninism, Marxism. He has like his own twist on Karl Marx's theory. So Lenin argued that a proletariat was already developing in Russia. Even though they didn't have the large number of factory workers, they didn't really have a large middle class, he's saying there's still the vast majority of Russian people are still oppressed. And so they're going to form a proletariat and revolt against the system, regardless of the fact that it's not exactly like Karl Marx's theory. Okay? And so this group of Marxists that followed Lenin's ideas are called the Bolsheviks. So why would Marxism be especially appealing in Russia? You can pause the video and talk about that for a minute if you'd like to. And I would say basically it's very appealing because in Russia, people have no legal way to have their voice heard. And so people feel like the government is never going to change on its own without drastic action by the people. And so Marxism offers a totally different vision of society, where after the communist revolution, what's supposed to happen, according to Marxism, is that society will be classless and everyone will share in the benefits and the profits of what society produces. So even in Russia, where they didn't have as much industrialization, we still have the peasants who are living really harsh lives, and the idea of having a classless society where they're now on the same level as the landlords would still be very appealing to people. So eventually we have a new monarch in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II comes to power in 1894, and he married a German princess named Alexandra. She's going to be influential later when we study the Russian Revolution. But basically, she was a strong believer in autocratic power or absolute government. And so she encouraged Nicholas to resist reforms. And Nicholas was especially opposed to the westernization of Russia. He didn't think all of this industrialization and Western influence was a good thing. So he made a speech in January 1895 where he denounced what he called the senseless dreams of those who favor democratic reforms. So that really gives us an insight into what he thought about power, I think, because you have all these different groups who just want some kind of change. They just want to know that the government is listening to them in some way. And then the new leader comes and makes a speech and says, anybody who wants any kind of representation or democracy, that's just a senseless dream, never going to happen. So think about how people would feel about that and about him at the time. So by the 1890s, unrest was growing, and this is a review of all the things I've been talking about this whole time. So don't feel like you have to relist them. You could just put a couple examples, and I'll just go through them pretty quickly. So peasants are disgruntled because they have heavy debts and they're living in poverty. Urban workers are upset about long hours, low pay, and poverty. So the people who are working in factories are experiencing the same issues of industrialization that factory workers have felt throughout the world. Radical ideas are spreading among the people. So anarchy, Marxism, all of these things are gaining popularity. And then with all these problems, workers and peasants have no legal political outlets for their rage. Workers held strikes and formed unions anyway, but all of this was technically illegal. So if you went on strike or you formed a union, you could easily be arrested and thrown in jail. And then Tsar Nicholas II, as we just learned, is really opposed to any kind of change. He's not interested in reforming the government in any way. So during this time period, despite defeat in the Crimean War, Russia had been conquering new territory throughout the 1800s. And they're especially, you can see expanding like to the south a little bit in what today are like the Stan countries, a little bit on the eastern side, north of China. They're still conquering new territory. So you can pause if you'd like and discuss these two questions. How is this similar to the USA in the 1800s? And is this imperialism? And if you notice that kind of blue or green territory over by the Pacific Ocean north of China, that's also very close to Japan. And so the fact that Russia is expanding in that direction causes some concern among people in Asia. So that's going to lead to a war called the Russo-Japanese War. So Japan at this time is greatly expanding its economy and it's acquiring new territory. And so by 1904, Japan was concerned about Russia's expansion into that territory north of China. And this led to war between Russia and Japan. Now, everyone in the world, despite Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, everyone in the Western world thought for sure that Russia would win because Russia is still this large and powerful empire. What happened is that Japan actually won, and when we go into the Japan PowerPoint tomorrow, you'll understand a little more of why that was the case. But Japan won, and this shocked the Western world. Some reasons why Russia was defeated. Well, Russia's military is centered way over on the western side, like over on the Baltic and the Black Sea. And so they had to move a lot of their supplies a very long distance to Asia, which was kind of hard to do. Japan's military, on the other hand, is right there. And so they're able to more quickly maneuver their military into position. And then something you'll learn tomorrow is that Japan had really embraced industrialization. And so by the early 1900s, Japan was pretty far ahead of Russia in terms of industrializing, and they're able to produce all of the supplies and weapons and things that were needed to fight this war effectively. So I would say one of the significant things about Russia's defeat is that it really continued to prove to the world that Russia was a little bit outdated in its technology and a little behind in its industrialization compared to some other countries. So it was another humiliating defeat for Russia. So Russia's defeat in this war led directly to the revolution of 1905. So we already know that people in Russia, urban workers and peasants, are disgruntled. And then people become increasingly upset now that Russia has been defeated in this war, because Russia is this huge empire and Japan is this small, geographically small nation, and they've been defeated. And so what happens is that people organize, and an urban leader drew up a petition to Tsar Nicholas with the workers' demands. So they write a letter to Tsar Nicholas, and they want to go to his palace and deliver it to him. And it's just asking for representation and workers' rights and things like that. What happens is that as they approach the Winter Palace, and this was a peaceful protest, like they're marching peacefully, not attacking anybody or anything like that, the guards at the palace get real nervous, and they end up firing onto the protesters and kill some of the protesters. This event where they fire onto the protesters and kill some of them is called Bloody Sunday. And this sparks the revolution of 1905. The key demands of the revolution are for a constitution for Russia and for the government to grant representation to the people. So this photograph shows you Bloody Sunday of 1905, and you can see to the front of the picture are the palace guards firing on the protesters, and you can see the protesters on the other side, like trying to run away and escape. And so even though this started just around the Tsar's Winter Palace, it spread throughout Russia. So you can see peasants revolt, they start armies mutiny, people start rioting throughout Russia, and what started as this one protest spreads throughout a lot of other populated parts of Russia. So the results of this, Nicholas II had to concede. He had to accept a constitution, and he accepted the formation of a parliament called the Duma. He also accepted some reforms for peasants. In reality, this was really too little too late, because in Nicholas's mind, he was like, okay, I'll sign the constitution, I'll open the Duma. But he was never really willing to give up his own power. And so the Duma did not have much decision-making ability. There really weren't a lot of meaningful reforms. It's sort of like he signed this and there were reforms on paper, but he didn't really follow through with it. And so the issues that the people were protesting against really continued to exist. So where does Russia go from here? Well, Nicholas II is still in power after the revolution of 1905, and all of those radical ideas like Marxism and anarchy and things like that still continue to have strong support in Russia. So when we come back to Russia, as we study World War I, we'll see what happens next in Russia, which is going to end up being the Communist Revolution. So that's the end of this section of the PowerPoint, so you can pause the video, and then the rest of this is going to be about changes in Japan. Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about Japan and how Japan embraced change in the 19th century. So compared to Russia that you learned about yesterday, Japan takes a very different approach to opening up to westernization and industrialization. And so that's what we're going to learn about today. So first we have to go back and kind of think about where Japan is at this particular time period. So back in chapter 22, we studied the Tokugawa shogunate. And one of the things that the Tokugawa shogunate had decided to do is to pretty much close off their country to all Western trade, except a little bit of Dutch trade at Nagasaki. And you might remember they did that to try to preserve their culture. So they felt like Christianity was spreading too quickly, and they just wanted to maintain their traditional Japanese culture. And now by the 1800s, the Tokugawa shogunate is having some issues. So economic problems. They're paying salaries to the samurai. You might remember that's because the samurai, now that the shogun is in power and there's not all these civil wars, the samurai don't really have much to do. And so they're paid by the government to become bureaucrats, but really it's like there's too many of them. The government is just paying all this money out to the samurai when they're not really a class that's really necessary anymore. And there's also slowing economic growth. There's also changes regarding religion. So Japan becomes a little bit more secular. Neo-Confucianism is still very important to the government. There's also educational changes. So they have the introduction of Dutch studies. Dutch studies are just Western-oriented schools. And all of these things you're going to read about more in more detail in your homework if you haven't already. This is just a real quick overview. Because the Dutch are the only Europeans that the Japanese are really interacting with at this time, they call them Dutch schools rather than like European or Western schools, just because that's their perspective. And so Japan's attitude towards the West is changing a little bit by this time, by the 1800s. So by 1800, almost all foreigners had been driven out of Japan, and Japan was a closed society, like I just reviewed. Western countries really wanted to get into Japan and trade because they had traded with Japan centuries earlier, and Western countries really felt like this would really benefit them if they could get into Japan and start trading with some of their products. So in 1853, the United States sent a fleet of ships led by Commodore Matthew Perry, who arrived in Edo, which is today Tokyo, carrying a letter from President Millard Fillmore. And the letter demanded that the Japanese treat U.S. shipwrecked sailors better, and that they eventually open trade with the United States. Now, the shipwrecked sailors thing I'll explain. So because Japan was a closed society, if you were sailing, say you're like on your way to China and your ship goes down and you're shipwrecked and you end up in Japan, because Japan didn't have relationships with foreigners, like who knows what would happen to you? You probably would never make it back to the United States. You didn't have any kind of rights or anything like that. So they want to fix that issue and then also open up trade. Japan was reluctant to agree to this, but Matthew Perry basically threatened them militarily. If you don't agree to this, we might attack you. And so Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. So some of the key provisions of the Treaty of Kanagawa: return of shipwrecked Americans, which I just talked about, opening of ports to traders, and they have to allow a U.S. consulate in Japan. So the U.S. wants to establish an embassy in Japan and establish formal relations with the Japanese government. And this is just a photograph of Matthew Perry and then the Americans arriving in Japan. So this new Treaty of Kanagawa led directly to the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, because the opening of Japan to foreign influence was very unpopular in certain parts of Japan. And so people revolted, and the shogun was forced to step down, and the emperor, who remember had always been there but hadn't really been in charge for centuries, was restored to being the true leader of Japan. And the new emperor, who's pictured here, Mitsuhito, established a new government, and he called this the Meiji. Meiji means enlightened rule. And so this period in Japan became known as the Meiji Restoration. All right, so let's talk about that for a minute. This is an important term, Meiji Restoration. Why is it called a restoration? Because the emperor is being restored to power. And then the Meiji, or enlightened rule, what is that going to symbolize for Japan? All right, so it's going to symbolize that they're going to be enlightened in the sense that they're going to open up to all kinds of new influences, which you're going to see. And if you look just at this portrait of Mutsuhito, I think it really represents that well. Look at his outfit. So he is wearing a very Western style military uniform, not traditional Japanese clothing. And that really symbolizes what the Meiji Restoration is all about. Once the emperor is restored, they're going to go full force pretty much into Westernization and industrialization during the Meiji Restoration. So throughout a lot of the rest of this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about all the changes of the Meiji Restoration. You're not going to be able to write all of them down, and that's okay, because you can review this PowerPoint at any time online. This is also all in your homework, so put some examples for each category, and that will be fine. So political changes. We already know the emperor was restored to power. There's no more shogun. They get rid of the 4 traditional social classes. So previously we have the shogun, daimyo, samurai, peasants. They formally abolish those official distinctions. Government officials were sent to Europe and the US to study Western political systems. So they're not really becoming a democracy, but they're still interested in how these governments run themselves efficiently in other places, and they're open to taking ideas from other countries. The Meiji rulers established a government system that was similar to Germany at the time. So they did establish a constitution. They did make a parliament that was called the Diet. What I don't want you to think is that they became a democracy, because they definitely did not. So they have a constitution and a parliament, but really only, I think, about 5% of people in Japan could vote. It was not very representative. Okay, so they're open to some change, but it's not any kind of major representation or democracy. And then also, they modernized their military and incorporated new technology based on Western-style militaries. And the government became very involved in industrialization. So we're going to see, just like in Russia, in Japan, the government is very influential in starting factories and really getting that going. Economic changes. The government-owned factories were open to manufacture products, and they established a whole section of their government, the Ministry of Industry, devoted solely to encouraging industrialization. So Japan really wants to go full force into industrialization once it's opened. They created the zaibatsu, which are huge corporations. Entrepreneurs developed businesses. A famous example from this time period that's still around today is Mitsubishi. So in Japan, there were some entrepreneurs who developed businesses, but they're still, because they had a more traditional social structure up until this point, like Russia, they still had a lot more government-owned factories than in, say, Western Europe. Important industries that developed: tea, silk, weapons and shipbuilding, and sake, which is an alcoholic drink. They changed their land and taxation system. And if you think about all the problems that come with industrialization when you rapidly industrialize and urbanize, those things happen in Japan as well. Okay, so think about like the tough working conditions, low pay, poverty, poor sanitation in urban areas. All of those things happen in Japan as well. And then another key thing to understand about Japan and its future from this point on in history is that they were dependent on foreigners for raw materials. So Japan is a very small country geographically. They don't have a lot of natural resources naturally on their own. And so they had to import them. That is going to play a role as we go forward and learn more about Japan and the decisions they make because of their need for natural resources for their factories. And another thing I'll just point out from these pictures shows another similarity to industrialization in places like Europe. So if you look at the pictures, think about who's working in these factories and how is that similar to other parts of the world that we've studied. Japan also underwent a lot of cultural changes. So they abolished feudalism, like I said before. They got rid of their 4 traditional social classes legally. That doesn't exist anymore. They were very heavily influenced by technology from other parts of the world. So they adopted the telegraph system, the railroad, banking, clocks, a Western-style calendar. If you want to, you could pause and just examine these prints for a minute and look at all the Western style things you see here. So in these, you see people wearing Western style clothing, not traditional Japanese clothing. You see in the bottom picture, Western style buildings, trolley cars. The other one, you see Western style ships, railroads. So all of those things flooded into Japan. They also adopted pastimes from Western nations. So baseball became very popular in Japan and is still popular in Japan today. They created a new education system that was modeled after US style education, but they still tried to keep some aspects of their traditional culture. So aspects of Shintoism, which was the traditional Japanese religion, those kinds of things emphasize loyalty to family, community, and devotion to the emperor, and the view of the emperor as a divine figure. So all of those things the Japanese government still encouraged. And this led to the growth of nationalism within Japan, because even though people were really excited about all these Western changes, they still wanted to hold on to the things that they felt like made them traditionally Japanese, and they took a lot of pride in things like that, like devotion to the emperor. These changes also led to a little bit of a change in the role of women. So previously, a woman's role in Japan was centered around marriage and serving the family. And I would say that didn't really change that much. Women were considered subordinate to men and were not supposed to work outside the home. But under the Meiji Restoration, now that they're industrializing, the Meiji leaders realized that women are going to be needed to work in these factories. And so they encourage women to get an education. And a lot of women did go to work in factories like we saw in those images before. But just like in Western Europe at this time, women are kind of supposed to be able to do both. Like, you're going to go work in the factory and provide for your family, but when you're at home, you're still supposed to be that ideal wife and mother. So their role changed a little bit, but not drastically. There also were changes in the family structure due to all this westernization. So just like in China, and we know that Japan was heavily influenced by Confucianism, this idea of filial piety and respect for elders was important in Japan too. So children previously, were supposed to be totally unquestioning of their parents, just obey anything their parents told them. And that started to change a little bit because as Western culture came in, children or young people, I would say children, but like people your age, started adopting all of these new trends and fads from the Western world. Like they changed their clothing, they changed their hairstyles, they adopt customs of the Western world. Successful students were encouraged to go abroad and study in a Western country. And so this created some tension within the family because the parents maybe are more traditional and the young people are just embracing all of this change. And so the older generations have a harder time understanding that. So if you look at these pictures to us today, these look old-fashioned, but this girl putting the waves in her hair, that was a really popular hairstyle in the 1920s in the United States, so she's imitating that. And then if you look at this other picture of these young people, again, they're dressed like people in the Western world would be in the early 1900s, so they're following those trends. And so this just leads to more of a divide in the family. Parents have overall less control of the children. Things like premarital sex increased as parents didn't have as much control over their young people's lives as they did before. So a review of the major challenges facing Japan at the end of the 19th century. There are generational disputes, and we just talked about that on the previous slide. All these Western changes were really embraced by the young generations, not so much by the older generations. There's industrial issues, so all those same issues of the lives of the factory workers, poverty, crowded urban areas, all these things are problems that are going to have to be dealt with. And then the Meiji government dissolved parliament. So how could this lead to unrest? Well, Japan wasn't very representative to begin with, but now people feel like even this symbol of having a parliament now is gone, and people don't have any kind of representation, and so that can lead to future issues. By the early 20th century, Japan became an imperialist nation. It's really important to understand why this occurred. Japan needed more raw materials for its growing factories. So Japan, again, is a geographically small nation with not many natural resources. But they have decided to go full force into industrialization. And so they've opened all these factories. They need resources to be able to produce products in those factories. And so they look out in their neighborhood in Asia and look at what areas could we possibly take over that we would be able to get natural resources from. Another secondary issue, I would say that is the main issue, but a secondary issue is that they still have this lingering group of people who used to be the samurai class who don't really have a role in society anymore. And so this provides a way to channel like that military energy into something positive for Japan. And so some examples of conflicts and takeovers of Japan in the early 1900s, the Sino-Japanese War, where they went into the area of China and extended their influence over Korea, which was annexed in 1910. And then the Russia-Japanese War that we just learned about yesterday, where they defeated Russia and took over some territory north of China. That's another example. So that pretty much finishes Russia and Japan, and you're going to do a comparison and I believe eventually a DBQ over some of these issues.